B-A-T. It's in the name.
Welcome into the Helping Healing Humor podcast with Ben and Travis. As it is Suicide Prevention Month, today's episode will be all about that topic, among other difficult issues, so listener discretion is advised. Joining us on today's episode is Drew Suttles. Drew is the preacher of the Quitman Church of Christ in Quitman, Georgia. He is also the host of the Weathering the Storm podcast on the Scattered Abroad Network. Be sure to look for those links in the description down below. Drew has a lot of amazing content to share with us, so we can't wait for you to hear it. And we'll get right to that interview after these messages.
This episode of the Helping Healing Humor podcast is brought to you by Howell Wealth Management. On the Helping Healing Humor podcast, we talk about anxiety and stress and its impact on our everyday lives. We know that finances, including planning for retirement, is one of the leading causes of stress. It can be confusing and overwhelming. There are differing opinions on the best approach. It can be hard to know who to trust. For our retirement planning, Whitney and I trust Greg Howell of Howell Wealth Management at Northwestern Mutual. Greg is professional, knowledgeable, and accessible. He looks at the whole picture and thinks outside the box to create ways to help you reach your financial goals. Retirement planning can be especially challenging for ministers who do not have the benefit of a 401k, but Greg's expertise and creativity can get you on the right path and give you confidence for the future. Text him to schedule your free 15-minute consultation today at 931-638-1576. Be sure to tell him Ben and Travis sent you. I'm Travis Creasy. That's our all-pro counselor, Ben Hayes.
Howdy.
And Will the Thrill.
What's up, fellas?
Not much, man. I'm just rocking my sweet pink disco dodgeball t-shirt, right? I'm certainly secure in my manhood. So I'm ready for October, but I'm also kind of double dipping because September is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month. So I'm wearing my pink shirt, raising money for St. Jude. And guess what, guys? You can get your fuchsia pink shirt just in time for October if you order it right now at benandtravis.com/store. And all proceeds from either this shirt or our 5K shirt will go towards our St. Jude team. So be sure to check that out. Once again, benandtravis.com/store. September, as I mentioned, is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month, but it's also Suicide Prevention Month. And we want you to know that you're never alone. That's part of the reason why this podcast exists. Mental health podcast, trying to help people kind of get through things that we've been through, we've shared about. We've had visitors on to talk about things that they've been through in an effort to be a part of God's hands and feet to help others get through it. And so just as we get started, before our interview begins, I just want to put this out here that the Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255, or you can text HOME to 741-741. Just want to make sure we get that important information out there.
Well, as advertised today, fellas, we have a wonderful guest, someone that I have admired from a distance. We've got Drew Suttles. I've got to admire Drew from a distance. We were at Freed Hardeman around the same time. And man, since he's taken off in ministry, just really enjoyed a lot of stuff that he's been putting out there. So Drew, thanks for joining us. How are you today?
Doing great, guys. Thank you for having me. We're looking forward to it.
Man, we are looking forward to this time together too. Appreciate you being with us. I've enjoyed listening to your podcast as well. So I'm going to start things off with the Friday refresh question of the day. You can check out, if you haven't already, Friday Refresh. It's a 3 to 5 minute motivational podcast. You can find it at benandtravis.com or really anywhere else that you get your podcasts. So, Drew, what inspired you to begin the Weathering the Storm podcast?
Well, it started with when I was doing my first work in Nashville, Tennessee, and I called it Thursdays with the Text, and it was on Facebook. So every Thursday I would take one verse and I would break it down. I did that for about a month, and then my friend Michael Clark, who I went to MSOP with, called me and said, "Hey, you ever thought about doing a podcast?" It's like you can reach a lot more people. You can put out the same kind of content, and you can help reach people. And so I got to looking into podcasts, and I got to thinking about, there's a podcast about this passage or about this theme. but I didn't see much about helping people get through difficult times, especially Christians, because the perception in our world is, well, you become a Christian and all the pain goes away. And that's not true. You read 2 Corinthians 11 and ask Paul how that went, and some of his writings to Timothy. If you live godly in Christ, you will suffer persecution. So it's to be expected. And I got to thinking, is there anything that I could say that might help somebody get through a difficult time? And that's kind of the basis for that podcast. And so I came up with the theme or the name, how do we get through the storm, hence weathering the storm? Because there's so many songs in our songbook that we sing about that. Keep me safe till the storm passes by, or, just these thoughts of how God can help us get through trials. So that's really how it started. It turned into a podcast, did that for about 2 seasons worth. And then some of us from the Memphis School of Preaching, we started the Scattered Abroad Network, and we put our content together. And so every day of the week, there's a new podcast coming out. And so mine airs every Thursday. And it's just been a really wonderful blessing from God to be able to reach out to people and hopefully help people get through difficult times.
Yeah, I want to encourage our audience. If you haven't listened to some of it, it's phenomenal content, very scriptural based. And I love the way you do it. And your heart. And I told you that earlier today. We talk about the weathering the storm. I know that you kind of have a story, a year that was pretty rough on you. And would you like to share, some of that to kind of give a background to maybe some of the wisdom that you now have when it comes to learning how to maybe help people?
And really, I'll preface that with thinking about David. When you read the book of Psalms and you think about David, it's one thing to read that. It's another thing to go back and read 2 Samuel 11 and then read Psalm 51. Mm-hmm. When you think of what he went through and then you read those words, it means a little bit more. And that's really what I lived. And, the first 3 seasons of the podcast, I was trying to get into biblical examples like Peter, Elijah, David, others who had to battle, difficult storms. And then I went through a year full of them. 2020 was a crazy year for all of us, obviously. That was a storm in and of itself. So March, the world kind of shut down. In April of 2020 is when my wife had twins. And that was a scary time for us because we didn't know what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. So my wife has really battled with anxiety from that point on. So there's anxiety with her. And then my dad, who struggled with anxiety and depression. And so here I am recording this podcast and studying about it. And I take a step back and I'm thinking, I've got loved ones who I interact with all the time that are going through this. So there was that anxiety and depression. And then thoughts started creeping into my mind, is everything okay with me? Never thought about it before. And if we're not careful, we'll get so bogged down with life that we won't take time for ourselves to really reflect and make sure that, we're right. So 2020 was a crazy year. My mom took the COVID vaccines. Unfortunately, the second shot that she took, she had an adverse reaction and she developed Guillain-Barré syndrome, which basically paralyzed her. And this started in her feet, started working her way up. And for 3 months, the doctors had no clue what was going on with her. So ultimately, she went to Emory in Atlanta. They figured out this is what you have. This is how you can treat it. So here I am with, my 4 children and the newborns and my wife and dealing with how can she get through this storm. And then my dad's depression, when my mom got her diagnosis, got worse and worse and worse. And we live, over 4 hours away. So I couldn't be there. So it tore at me. I want to be there for her. I want to be there for him. I want to be there for my wife. I want to be there for my kids. I want to be here for my congregation. So I realized very quickly, okay, I'm in a storm. And what I've been talking about these last few years, now I'm the one who's experiencing. So long story short, my mom got a little bit better, but my dad did not see light at the end of the tunnel. He didn't think she was ever going to get better. He didn't think she was ever going to come home. So October 28, 2021, my dad took his life. And I was there. I was on the other side of the wall. And so it was a very difficult time because we were actually going to see my mom that day because her birthday was the 30th. And so I was excited. So the night before, we watched the World Series game together with the Braves. We love watching baseball together. And so told him that night, I said, I'll see you tomorrow. I'll be in there. We're going to go see Mama together. He said, yeah, sounds great. I'll see you tomorrow. And that was the last time I ever talked to him. And so I found him. Again, he'd taken his life. I had to call 911. Had to go through, the people coming in. And here's the thing. My wife and kids were with me. My kids were there. And so I'm trying to battle. How do I keep calm without startling them? The next thing I know, we've got family coming, police coming, people are in my house. And here's my mom has no idea this is happening. So as horrible as it was for me to find him the way I did, it was almost as horrible having to go to my mom in a nursing home and tell her what happened. And so I had to break the news to her just an hour after it happened. And what was so tough was she had dressed up that day. She had her makeup. She was getting progress. She was starting to move. And I was so worried this is going to crush her and she'll never get back on her feet. So I dedicated my last season of Weathering the Storm to my dad, who suffered with mental illness and depression, but also to my mom, who was fighting. She had just lost her husband. She's lost her health, but she never lost her faith, ever. And it was such an inspiration to me to think, she's getting up and battling this every day. I can do it too. And maybe others feel like there's no way I can move forward, but you can. And that was something that really, really helped me. And so the end of the year, all the way through December, we had to, get through the trials of, all the financial things that come with it that nobody prepares you for. The emotional pain that everybody's going through because of this. And then, so my mom, we invited her to come and live with us. So she's been with us since January. It's been a blessing. So now there's 7 of us in the house. But of course, with my dad being gone, it's crazy. Next month will be a year since it happened. Wow. So, one night we're watching the World Series. The next day I find him, he's taking his life. And then Monday I preached his funeral.
Wow.
And my mom couldn't even be there because, there was a COVID going on and she couldn't move. She couldn't walk. So that was probably the lowest time of my life. But at the same time, it's the time that I can go back and say, God is our refuge and strength became a reality for me that day. It's one thing to read Psalm 46 and it's one thing to read it. But when it comes to life like that's something that is so powerful about the Word of God. It's living and active.
I started listening to the podcast right around that time, some of the episodes, and it was very, you could tell it was very real, very raw, with you, what you were going through. And it was refreshing too, to see what you said. And I think it's important for people to be able to understand. I meet with people all the time about grief and so many times there's this feeling of, I can't think this way or feel this way. I'm bad if I feel angry or sad or whatever else. And, the reality is grief's going to make you have all those things. And God knows that, and he's okay with that. So when it comes to that, what would you say, what are some things that you would say to families that are struggling, or churches that are trying to help families that are struggling? What would you say to them or say for them to do in those scenarios?
I would take them to the model that Jesus gives us in John chapter 11. We learn so much about Jesus. We learn so much about death. We learn so much about the pain that comes with it, just in the reaction of Mary and Martha. And it wasn't that they didn't believe. Of course they believed, but what did they both say? Same exact language. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And sometimes when tragedy strikes, that's what people do. God, where are you? Where have you been? Yeah. And so we can learn a lot from John 11. I would point members of the Lord's church to that chapter and just let it unfold. Think about what we learn about Jesus. We learn about his deity and his humanity. I'm the resurrection and the life. And 10 verses later, Jesus wept. Yeah. So you've got somebody that showed real emotion. It's okay to show real emotion. It's okay to hurt. It's okay to grieve. He grieved. It talks about him moving with indignation when he said, where had they laid him? And that same word picture is when, Judas and the others were upset about the oil that was broken on him. They moved with indignation. It means to snort like a bull. And was he mad at sin? Was he mad at death and what it does to people? You see real emotion coming from Jesus. But then you learn that it's okay to weep. Jesus said it for our benefit. It's like going to sleep. Lazarus, our friend, sleeps. I go to wake him up. So I would teach churches and teach, again, members of the Lord's church to really emphasize this world is not our home. And we've got to be reminded of that every day. And we believe wholeheartedly Jesus is the resurrection life. He's the way, the truth, and the life. And through him, we can have the hope to face tomorrow because, listen, storms are coming. If you're not in one right now, they're coming. Sometimes you can see them on the horizon. Sometimes you can't. But the one constant is if you have Jesus in your boat, then you're going to be able to get through the storm.
If you're not in the midst of a storm, just wait longer. It's coming.
Right.
And we're in a season of preparation, and you're helping other people as well. And I think you mentioned the awakening, this waking up to a reality that Jesus lived in all the time. We sometimes can lull ourselves to sleep. And I think to some degree, we're all asleep. And the more I realize, the more I live, and the older I get, and the more wisdom I get, experiential wisdom, I come to the conclusion everybody is struggling. And we had a question about warning signs. And just to be honest, a lot of times, like you said, you didn't have, you knew he was struggling because of the circumstance. Everything that was going on, you couldn't help but be struggling, but everybody was. And so I don't know that there's necessarily warning signs. Ben may be able to speak to this a little better than me and yourself as well, but we just need to assume that people are struggling with something. Maybe you could speak to that, maybe some things that you've learned since that time about human nature and maybe warning signs, or maybe you would put it in different language.
Yeah, that's a great point, great thought. And I'll say this, depression is a monster. It's just a monster. And it eats at people. And unfortunately, what so many try to do is try to bury it deep, deep down. I would say to anybody listening that's battling that, meet it head on, get the help and the attention that you need, but whatever you do, don't hide it. Because you might think you're the only one being affected by it, but I can promise you you're not. And I reached out to my dad in many, many ways. And I said this at his funeral. The one regret I don't have is that I preached the gospel to him. In fact, I was preaching at a gospel meeting. That's why I was up there the week that he did that. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, he was there every night. And my theme for that meeting was weathering the storm. Don't assume that everybody's got it all together.
Much to your saying is to get it out in the open, drag it into the light, and then God can use, he can redeem it. And I think that's an important message to anybody who's struggling with, well, it's over. There's nothing I can do about this. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. I remember that thought. I'm always going to be in the midst of this leukemia battle. It's never going to end. I don't see but God tells us in his word that it's not over till he says it's over. Now, it's not a direct quote, so I apologize. But generally speaking, he's the one who gets to determine when it's over. And so there's always that hope. And that's something we want to do. And I'm sure that comes through in your podcast and your message and your preaching and in your ministry. And we like to make things practical, and we'll do it from time to time of, do you have some do's and don'ts as far as the church's reaction to this type of thing, either with your dad or your mom or any of the stuff that you went through? Are there things that you wish people hadn't said or wish they had said, or things that they did really well?
I'll say, number one, the church needs to address it. Let's not act like it's a taboo issue that we don't need to talk about. We need to talk about it. It needs to be preached about. It needs to be taught in Bible class. We need to be sitting in people's homes and checking on them, making sure they're okay. As far as the things that people did really well is that they were there. And when you find yourself in a moment like that, you're not going to remember what people say, but you'll remember if they were there or not. And I had friends from Memphis School of Preaching that traveled from Alabama, Louisiana, all over the place that were there. And just them being there meant so much to me. And then I had some brethren from Quitman, had about 20 members that drove 5 hours to be there the day of the funeral. And that's how God works through his people. And I felt alone, but at the same time, I wasn't. And I had them with me. We think about Job's friends. That's the good model. They did everything right until they started talking. They sat with him and they were doing great. And then later he says, miserable comforters are you. Because they're trying to say, Job, I know what you're going through. Job could have said, look, have you buried 10 children today? Because I have. You haven't. I have. Did your wife say, curse God and die? Because my wife did. So sometimes if we'll take a step back and just realize I don't have to have all the answers. I just need to be there and let them know I'm there, that I love them and that I'm praying for them and they're not going through it alone. I think that'll go a long way.
I've just got through teaching Job to middle schoolers for some reason, but that's what I've been teaching them. And every time like the friend talks, for some reason in my mind, I kept saying, Elihu has entered the chat. And it's like when they enter the chat, things don't go very well.
I've shared this with you before. I probably on the podcast I've shared this, but as a counselor, I always beat myself up because I don't have the right words sometimes to say. And even the research says the most important part of the counseling relationship is the counseling relationship. It's not the therapeutic interventions and all these different things. It's if you can establish that relationship with somebody to where they can share the things they need to share, then you can kind of work on the rest of it and do what you need to do. But you got to establish those relationships, and that's what makes the difference. And that's what makes the difference in the church, I think.
Drew, I've got something for you. And maybe it's because I'm an Enneagram 7, and we always like to take something bad and reframe it into something good. It's the way me and Travis work. But I think a lot of times there's a lot of tragic things that happen in life. But I think it's always good for us to see, how did somebody grow through such a tragic event or situation that happened in life? And so I'm just kind of curious, like, how have you seen yourself maybe grow or become better after going through these several storms, that you had to endure as a person?
I mentioned Psalm 46, and that's really been helpful. Just working through that whole text, you're reminded of God's availability. And sometimes we may forget that, but I've learned to look at the sunrise more, and to look at the sunset more, and to pay attention to birds, and to pay attention to the breeze, and to pay attention to the fact that Psalm 19 is reality. The whole creation screams the greatness of God, and that's what we find. But then there's also special revelation, same text, Psalm 19. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. God's word is the way he reveals himself to us. So creation tells us that God is. The Bible tells us who God is. And it has really come alive to me even more. The example I would use is of Elijah. 1 Kings 18, he was on a spiritual high. He just came off the mountain, literally, and what a great victory. And all the people said, God, the Lord, he is the Lord. And what an awesome victory. Then 1 Kings 19, Elijah says, Lord, take my life. I'm ready to die. How do you get from the mountaintop to the valley? And that's really kind of where I felt like, spiritually speaking, the Lord was opening up doors and opportunities. I've been teaching Bible at Georgia Christian School down here in South Georgia, opportunities to go and counsel at Georgia Bible Camp, and all these opportunities to preach and teach. Spiritually, I was feeling just on the mountain, and then that happened, and I was in the valley. What I've learned is that God is the God of the peaks and the valleys. He was there with Elijah on the mountain. He was there with Elijah in the valley. You're reminded that Elijah was, you're not by yourself. I got 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. You're not alone. And Elijah, what did he tell him? Go eat something, get some rest. Very practical things that he needed. God always knows what we need. But then think about Elisha. Elijah had no idea the impact he could make on another life and on the lives of so many others if he would have given up and thrown in the towel. It would have been easy for me to throw in the towel and say, I'm not doing this. But my hope is if I can help one person hang on a little bit longer, if I can help one person to hear and obey the gospel, if I can help one person get to heaven, it's all worth it. And Elijah, even in that moment, when he just trusted in God, the fact that he was available, God's reliable, God's powerful, then he was introduced to Elisha. And you think of the lives that Elisha touched, and even our lives as we go and read from the Old Testament, Romans 15:4. So, again, to those who are listening, you may feel like it's not worth holding on. It is. It can change not only your world, but the world of someone else and the world around you just by being still and knowing that God is in control. And he can use you even in that valley to make a difference in somebody's life.
On this podcast, we like to ask a fun question so that our listeners can get to know you. We can get to know you better and bring out a little bit of your personality along with all that. And so This fun question, or questions that Will is about to deliver, is brought to you by the good old-fashioned Dislike podcast, which is our 3 to 5 minute college football rivalry or pro football rivalry podcast that we do. That's just pure data-driven analytics. Okay, that's not true. It's all of our opinions based on nothing that has to do with football or very little. But anyways, Will, take it away.
All right, Drew. So we know that you're a big Clemson fan. One of the only ones that I've ever met.
I know a couple.
Legitimately.
Yeah.
And so what we want to know is who's the better quarterback, Deshaun Watson or Trevor Lawrence? And did Dabo and Clemson with Deshaun Watson really run a pick play to win the national championship and cheat Alabama out of another national championship?
I'm going to go with Deshaun Watson, even though I love Trevor Lawrence. He's from Bartow County, which is the same county I'm from, up in North Georgia. My cousin helped coach quarterback at Cartersville High School, so I knew about Trevor long before he went on to Clemson. But if you go back to the 2015 game with Clemson, Alabama, it's a lot closer than people might remember, 45-40. If it weren't for Saban kicking an onside kick, Kenyon Drake taking the kickback, we actually had a strong team in 2015. Deshaun Watson played his tail off that game, and I would say he's the better one because of what he did the next year and the way that he fought through an injury at South Carolina last game of the year, came back ACL, and man, that 2016 game, when Jalen Hurts ran scampering, I was like, it's over. And so I looked at the clock and I said, we've got some time. And so, I've watched all the background to all this. Deshaun came up to his team and he said, guys, we're going to go win this thing. And Dabo told him before the game, our word is love. We're going to win tonight because of love that we have for another. I love all that stuff. I buy into that stuff. Well, then you've got Wayne Gallman. You got Artavis Scott. You got Mike Williams catching balls all over the place he isn't supposed to catch. The play that Renfro catches is called Orange Crush. And so you've got the guy that comes up on the play, and Renfro sneaks through the crack right there to the right. That's a play they've ran all year, was never called. In the moment, it's going to be under more of a magnifying glass, of course.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, sure-handed Renfro snags that ball, man. First time since 1981, Clemson got a piece of it. And then 2018 was just a totally different story. That 2018 team was unreal. And I felt like the 2015 and 2016 games were awesome between Bama and Clemson. And everybody was getting tired of it, but I thought, man, you're getting to see, Ali and Frazier right here. You're getting to see some dudes going at it. And the 2018 game with Tua, I thought that was a stronger team. Tua and Judy, those dudes were stout. And A.J. Terrell gets the pick six early, and then Justin Ross is one-handed catches behind his head and all that. ETN was special. It's just been awesome, man, because growing up watching Clemson, they were mediocre every year. And when Tommy Bowden got out and Dabo took over, the culture changed. We beat LSU in 2012, and that's kind of what propelled us. So
I appreciate you being on. I appreciate what you're doing with your podcast. Once again, just want to remind everybody, Weathering the Storm podcast, go check it out. Be sure to subscribe. Let him know how much you appreciate him and all the things that and the light that he's showing, that the Lord's using him in the midst of these storms and shining light on other things that are going on, especially in Scripture. And of course, we don't want anybody to forget to hit the subscribe button on the Helping Healing Humor podcast. Give us a like, rate, review, share the episode, whatever platform you're on, whatever lingo they use. We certainly would appreciate it. And Drew, we'll have you back on, I'm sure, at some point. That'd be great.
Thanks for being with us for this episode of the Helping Healing Humor podcast. Be sure to download our free ebook, 28 Days of Focused Living, at benandtravis.com and receive all of our Helping Healing and Humor extra content directly in your inbox. We look forward to having you join us at the same Ben and Travis time, same Ben and Travis channel.